coordinating committee folks can take a seat at the table. Everyone should have their name flyers, or let me know if we're missing anybody.
I'm so happy to see you.
We'll get settled in.
Try not to undo it. No, she's not yet.
For the public, there are agendas and a sign-in list there, just so you know who's here for the meeting. And we also have a sign-up sheet for CCC members, which I'll hand around now, Cynthia. And if folks could just mark their name. Because we have some new faces in the audience tonight, why don't we just do a quick round of introductions of the CCC members. So name and affiliation would be much appreciated. My name is Patrick Field. I'm a facilitator with the Consensus Building Institute, or CBI.
Dean Taliaferro, the EPA project manager for the General Electric Housatonic River site.
Tom Potter, NRD trustee, lead administrative trustee for Housatonic River, Mass DEP.
Tom Barzatini, Citizens for PCB Removal, Pittsburgh.
Susan Peterson, Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection.
Becky Cushing, I'm the director for Mass Audubon and Berkeley County.
Lauren Gafferty, Berkshire Regional Planning Commission.
Barbara Chamberini, Citizens for PCB Removal.
Judy Herkimer, the Housatonic Environmental Action League, Cornwall Bridge, Connecticut.
Liz Fowler, Housatonic River Commission, North Haven, Connecticut.
Tim Gray, Housatonic River Initiative, Town of Lee.
Dennis Regan, Housatonic Valley Association.
Shep Evans, Housatonic Valley Association, and Town of Great Barrington Conservation Commission.
James Shaggy, Berkshire County League of Sportsmen and Travel Limited.
Adam Friedman, Town of Sheffield, and Housatonic River Initiative.
Jane Wynn, Berkshire Environmental Action Team.
Rob Baker, Conservation Limited with the City of Pittsfield.
Valerie Anderson from Pittsfield, Housatonic Clean River Coalition.
John Ziegler with Mass DEP.
Osamu Kumisaka, and I'll be taking notes.
And just and the audience folks who are EPA representatives, Jim Murphy, do you want to just introduce yourself?
Jim Murphy, EPA.
Okay, and Kelsey?
I'm Kelsey Dumbo with the EPA.
Tim?
My name is Tim Conway. I'm an attorney for EPA. And we also have John Seddon from our press office.
Great, perfect. And thank you all for coming out tonight. Really appreciate it.
Could you tell me the name of that person again?
My name's John.
John?
Yep, my last name is Sen, S-E-N-N.
And you're from EPA?
Yes, I
What's your
work
title?
in the communications office with Jim and Kelsey.
Thank you.
Great. All right, let me just run through the agenda and we'll dive right in. We did introductions, obviously. We'll do a quick agenda review. As always at the start of the meeting, the Technical Assistance Grant recipient, which is HRI, via Tim, has a chance to just give a quick update on the issues that have come up since we last met, so I'll turn to Tim in a moment. Rest of River is the rest of River beyond the 1.5 miles that's still under consideration for how to move forward. It's in a mediation process, and Tim Conway and Dean will speak to that, I think relatively briefly, but speak to that. And if others want to speak to that, because I know there's been some outreach recently, may do so. Then we've really got 3 detailed technical presentations, 2 maybe a little shorter and 1 longer. Rising Pond PCB air sampling results. Dean, I think you wanted to do chlorobenzene second.
Yeah, I was going to switch that around.
Okay, chlorobenzene exceedances of the mass contingency plan, and then a sampling of various kinds at the Allendale School. And we'll cover those. Well, generally the format is presentation, CCC asks questions as we go, and we try to provide at least a little time for a little public comment on each section as we go, so people don't have to wait till the very end, just depending on time. I think where's Tim? Tim Gray had raised a concern about the HRI EPA agreement from 2001, so we have a chance just to talk about that as need be. So Tim will turn to you to start on that later if you wish. And if we have time, we'll talk about our process review recommendations from a bit ago. And then we'll do any additional public comment and try to close.
In the interest of just consolidating me, maybe Tim and Tim can go together, and I'll see my first chance to speak together with Tim. Okay. So we can talk about what we asked for last month.
So you want to do that at the 640 part?
It doesn't matter, we could do it right off, or we could do it at the 640 part, it doesn't matter. I'm just saying, you don't need to have me talk twice.
Okay, that's great. Judy?
I'd like to make an addition of bridges in Massachusetts and Connecticut and put it before the CCC process review.
Yep. Bridges in Connecticut and Mass. Okay, and Jane?
I just want to point out we've got a lot of new people in the audience and that there's no representative from GE here.
Right. So the CCC, there's a seat at the table for General Electric representation. They have not been attending for some time. And also, just so folks know from the media, the cable station that's recording is
CGSB.
South Carolina. So, hence all the fancy microphones. Okay, great. So we'll skip TAG grant recipient. We'll catch up Tim and Tim when we get at 6:40. So Tim Conway, do you want to give an update to the mediation in Rescue River?
Sure. Is this on?
It's not for information.
So, as most of you know, EPA selected a cleanup proposal. Let me stand over here so everybody can see. In October 2016, EPA selected a cleanup proposal for the Rescue River, going from the confluence of the east and west branches all the way down wherever the contamination leads, all the way down to Long Island Sound. 5 separate parties challenged that cleanup decision before EPA's Environmental Appeals Board. We went through a process of briefing and discussing what was the most appropriate solution. And at the end of that process, the Environmental Appeals Board, it agreed with the EPA with our proposed cleanup on all of the issues about how much cleanup in each part of the river to do. But the Environmental Appeals Board also, what they call remanded, it sent back to our regional office for further development the administrative record on what is the appropriate disposal location for all the excavated PCBs that come out of the sediment or the soils from the Rescue River. So that the Environmental Appeals Board, based on arguments made, asked EPA to further develop the record and make a determination on what the most appropriate disposal location was for all that contaminated material. And we've been in the process of doing that this past several months, and we have a very strong team working on putting together that information, and we don't have a specific time frame for issuing that, but we will be issuing a determination for public comment, and I can't say when, but we're working on that very hard. At the same time as we were doing that, EPA decided that it would be useful for us to use that time also for looking at whether discussions could lead to any kind of a decision which would eliminate the litigation, which is something that could lead to a better cleanup, faster cleanup that gets started a lot faster, and that it would be acceptable to all the parties. And we have been, through the past several months, in mediated discussions with the different parties who entered into the mediation with EPA, and those processes are continuing. The specific discussions in any of the mediated discussions are privileged. One of the things about mediation is that allowing confidential discussions allows for more candor among the parties. Many of the parties that are part of the mediation are represented here today, along with some who aren't here today. And those discussions are ongoing, and there hasn't been a decision point reached on that, but that's the status of the Rescue River discussions at this point.
CCC members, any questions about that? And I'll have Dean on the non-contested items. Judy?
We haven't heard a word about what's going on since the last meeting, which I couldn't attend, with Mr. Bickerman. Is he here tonight?
No, he's not here tonight.
So what is the status without breaching confidentiality?
I know that EPA has talked to several of the parties that are, EPA along with the mediator have talked to several of the parties, and I think the mediator has talked separately without us to many of the parties to the mediation. There's been one sort of overall meeting of the parties in September, and I don't think there's been any second one of those.
Benno and then Reed.
So,
I'm sorry, Judy, already answered.
so what is the next step?
I think there's several steps. I think it's the mediator continuing to talk individually with different parties and using his discretion on when it would be better to have an overall meeting or a meeting with more than one of the parties. So I think it's not a process of where every meeting is attended by all the parties, because there's been a lot of meetings we haven't been part of, but I think it's getting a sense of what each party's objectives would be in terms of whether there is a way of getting a cleanup that can be expedited, can be a better cleanup, and it's acceptable to everyone.
And who are the 5 parties to the proceedings?
I think there's more than 5 parties to the proceedings.
Are the parties confidential or not?
No, the parties are not confidential. But the people who had signed one or at least one version of the mediation agreement include what they call the Western River Municipal Committee, which represents 5 towns in Berkshire County: Lenox, Lee, Stockbridge, Sheffield, and Great Barrington. The city of Pittsfield is a party. The General Electric Company, EPA, State of Connecticut, Housatonic River Initiative, Berkshire Environmental Action Team, and Jeff Cook.
So
and Mass Audubon.
And Mass Audubon. So I wrote to you and a while ago and asked you why HEAL was not considered a formal party to the proceedings in the Environmental Appeals Board as we signed off. We were a signer to the HRI HEAL brief. And I never heard back from you. And the EAB computer system where you lodge the appellant information in only allows for one entity. So is HEAL a party to the proceedings?
If a HEAL member is part of one of the other parties, they're welcome to join that other party. But HEAL was not, the Environmental Appeals Board had 5 petitioners that challenged the cleanup. And the way they listed them are the 5 that I mentioned: Housatonic River Initiative, GE, Jeff Cook, BEAT, and HRI.
So I should bring this question back to the EAB?
I don't think so. I don't think they're involved at this point.
So who should Judy bring, if she's concerned about her participation, who does she bring that concern to directly to have it clarified?
I'd say the mediator is in charge of the mediation.
So reach out to Mr. Bickerman directly. Okay. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let me go Benno, Reed, and then I don't know if I have a comment. So Benno?
If the mediation produces no results or ends up being at an impasse, does the EPA still retain any ability to proceed with a cleanup even if it is taken to court by GE? I know under Superfund, at least historically, the EPA had the ability to proceed with a cleanup, and if I remember correctly, also had the ability to charge treble damages and costs to the responsible party. Is any of that in the current environment still hold to be true?
Yes, under the consent decree, if GE and EPA are in a dispute during the Environmental Appeals Board or further litigation, EPA does have the ability to require GE to perform activities that are uncontested obligations, which Dean has been, for the past year, has been requiring GE to submit reports and do preliminary design work for things that are uncontested. So that's one chunk that's already started. And then there are provisions that under some circumstances EPA can actually perform work on our own while the challenges are happening. You also mentioned treble damages. The idea of treble damages or triple damages, it's not for all Superfund actions, but just for when EPA issues a unilateral administrative order to a party. If the party unreasonably refuses to comply with it, then EPA can seek to recover all of our damages multiplied by 3 or triple damages I guess as a way of deterring people from that type of unreasonable non-compliance. That's not the situation under our consent decree, because we entered into a consent decree rather than issuing a unilateral administrative order.
Okay. And the follow-up question is, in the flow chart of supremacy between EAB and the EPA, are you allowed to simply proceed with your original plan, cleanup plan, and then of course GE has the right to take you to court, but can you ignore what I understand it to be a recommendation from the EAB that we explore other possible ways of dealing with the spoils? Or does EAB have the last word on this? Do they have to hold the cards and insist that until you come up with a different solution to what you had originally decided upon, that there is no solution, there is no work going forward?
A good question. I do not read the Environmental Appeals Board's decision as requiring us to choose a different decision. I read it that what they told us was that they don't think that we had enough information in the record to support the determinations we made about disposal, and that they asked us to go back and review the record and potentially further develop the record with regard to the disposal decision. So I don't think they required a particular outcome in terms of our review of the administrative record.
So what would that look like? I mean, what additional information or what additional work is on your shoulders at this point to perform to both satisfy that recommendation for them and for yourselves? Could you theoretically proceed with your original recommendation for cleanup, irregardless of anything else?
We can't proceed irregardless of anything else. I think what we're doing is we are evaluating the questions they asked. They had one specific area they wanted us to definitely focus on, and then their opinion says that we should also look back at 5 or 6 other areas to see what the record says. So what we've done is to look at the record at that time, and to evaluate whether more information in the record would help. We received submissions from different towns as well as the Commonwealth of Massachusetts with respect to information for the record, and we developed our own information on the record that can lead to an overall, and the goal is to review all the information in that record to make a decision or determination for public comment on what the appropriate disposal is.
It sounds pretty nebulous and mysterious to me. And it also, at least from my perspective, and I think it's shared by many people, the EPA bent over backwards in terms of accumulating and assessing data for decades, if you will, in order to reach the determination that they had reached. I can't imagine what was missing and what more can be done to further delineate the appropriate steps to be taken now. And I'm just quite at a loss for understanding what steps you're actually going through, aside from this sort of mysterious process that you've tried to describe.
We're gathering information where we think the board asked for it, and we're going to evaluate that information.
Let me get Reed, Becky if you wanted to, Barbara, and just because of time, I will probably move on.
Thank you.
Reed Anderson, CCC member, and knowing that a lot of what is going on behind these closed doors with these people, I feel a little bit like the mediation is you're mediating our lives, our livelihood in southern Berkshire County. Those are the people that are working here, they're living here, they're farming here, they've created businesses and have families here. It is frustrating to hear what a nebulous and mysterious thing is going on, and I would caution that short-term gain, such as local construction companies bidding on creating the dumps and creating jobs short-term, be marked as a very poor mediation device. And I would caution that, I would remind that it is, we who are most affected by what is going on here, and that any mediation being done, I know I'm not in one of these groups to show up there, and I think I got 24 hours notice when we were going to meet with Bickerman, and I have 2 kids and I'm a stay-at-home dad. That's a bit tight for me, but I'm pretty loosey-goosey too. So I would just caution that it is not just mine, but the community at large's lives that are being mediated. And short-term gains are not what we are looking for. And I think I speak for most everybody in my community, at least.
Becky,
Tim, answer my question.
Okay.
Thanks.
Barbara.
My question, I guess, is more of a statement or rhetorical question, but what I can't wrap my brain around is we've worked on this for so long, and we've been promised things like innovative technology would be incorporated, especially with the fact that the consent decree was basically split in 2, so that the second half could have the time to look at these things and consider these things and choose these things. And then when it goes to something like the EAB, they tell us, well, you have to conform with what's been before. So my question is, it just seems like a never-ending circle chasing our tails. When and how and where is the process, after decades of this, of looking at the old technologies, which we're already going to address tonight, have are already in the process of failing on this very site, let alone other sites around the country. How do we get to the point, like Reed says, that it's not a short-term solution, but a long-term solution, actual solution? I mean, it just, I can't wrap my brain around the fact that people in a court with robes on will say, well, just go do it the way it's done before. Well, then you have those people, like Reed says, live in our communities and deal with the after effects of it. There is tremendous amount of disease and suffering going on in this community from this chemical contamination. And I'd like to make the point that modern medicine now is getting to the point where they're so targeted, all these commercials we see on TV for specific diseases and a very specific drug targeting a very specific chemical process on one particular cell. That's how precise they're getting. And this site is full of dozens, hundreds, thousands of chemicals, each of which has their own list of things they can do to living beings, and none of which belong in any of our bodies, or the food we eat, or the air we breathe, or the water we drink. And then that doesn't even take into account that when you put them all together in a dump, what they combine and create, things we don't even know about, have not even discovered or analyzed. And somebody in Washington is saying, just keep doing what you're doing, it's fine. So how do we get to the point where we break out of this vicious, ridiculous, nonsensical, toxic cycle? You can answer it if you want to.
Tim, maybe final word on this and just get the time I want to.
Yeah, I could say something about everything that's been said so far. I started off with Reed and just saying what he's saying, and the only reason that we basically are signing on to mediation is because it was our understanding that if we don't, they could take our standing away, eventually going into court. So we signed on to this thing. We are not happy with it, and we totally agree with what Reed is saying, because it is a complete mirror of the year 2000 when the consent decree was signed, and here we are 17 years later then basically saying the same things we said back in the year 2000, where none of the people were really invited to the table back then. The mediation is really a way that I look at it, is that they have created a mechanism that basically doesn't allow the public to participate. Okay, it allows the groups, the ones that file the brief, but you know how many people don't file a brief and have strong feelings like Reed does, that have children in a site, and all these other people who live along the river and in Pittsfield that all have children at this site, who always seem to be forgotten. Tonight I noticed we're going to be talking about the great Allendale school data, when you know, who in this room with the right mind would approve putting all that toxic waste next to an elementary school? But guess what happened? The EPA and GE came to a settlement, and there we have it. So we at HRI believe that anything can happen at this site, because we've been at it for 25 years, and we've watched you guys do a lot of stuff that really sometimes make our heads spin. And we were talking to Mr. Vickerman about the fact that we want a mechanism to have the public be able to be involved in the mediation. I mean, for the least, they should be allowed to come into the meeting and see what's going on publicly, right? Here we are, these 15 people with the, you know, the brief. We now can hide in a cave and have these meetings, and it is very absurd. Public is left out. A lot of the public that are caught up in this mess are left out, because there's really two types of public. There's the public that love our river and want it cleaned up, and then there's the public who get, you know, dragged into the whole thing because they own contaminated property. or something like that. So the mediation has been one terrible meeting. I'm just giving you a little assessment because nobody tells you these things. The first meeting, I mean, everybody that was at that meeting, raise your hand if you think it was a pretty absurd meeting. It was pretty much the most absurd meeting going for 25 years of meetings. We couldn't believe the way the meeting was, quote, mediated. We asked for the mediator not to be put into place. EPA ignored us, and now we have this guy, and he's a piece of work. He's knocking on my door at 8:30 in the morning. Stuff like this. It's like, excuse me? Did I invite you for breakfast? No, but this guy's a little bit wacko. Not that I'm not wacko, but this guy's wacko. And
You don't get paid for it.
I don't get paid for it. I get paid 70. Somewhere we saw a figure for like 70,000 to Bickerman. He's making a lot of money, this guy, and we don't see the results from our first meeting. In fact, the Stockbridge representative that night lit into him, and he couldn't believe how stupid a meeting it was. And he was a new guy at the meeting. He just said, what's going on here? Is this a meeting? So there's just a lot of stuff going on here, and this whole mediation already after the first meeting stinks. We're very disappointed by it, and we're very pessimistic about what this mediation will end up doing, except for allow the GE lawyers to maybe find another way to wiggle out of a little more cleanup, which is what they do so good.
I think Tim raises two really good points. And if we have enough time, I can respond to it. If not, I mean, we can.
Let's hear it.
I want to hear it.
Yep, you want
I think he raises two good points. One is, Dean and I, we were part of the group who negotiated the consent decree with a more limited group 20 years ago. And Dean and Jim and I have listened for quite a long time that you felt like that was not representative of the public. And this time around, we pushed to make there's always a trade-off between total inclusiveness and the ability to have a manageable group that can make a solution. And in 1997, EPA and the two states made a decision that a smaller group with City of Pittsfield, GE, and the two states and EPA and Justice would be the right move. It yielded an agreement, but it also yielded a community that was very disappointed in their involvement, the lack of involvement. We thought this time around, let's push for a different place on that spectrum of inclusiveness versus, ability to do things efficiently. And so we think we had to draw a line somewhere, we believe, to allow for some efficiency in the negotiations. And so we thought it was an appropriate way to include the parties that were affected enough to challenge us. Plus, Audubon is a major landowner. The City of Pittsfield is a major landowner. And so we thought that was a fair balance. And I stand by that. I think that's a fair balance. If people aren't involved, I would like to see us do more. And we just haven't had the right decision point for it. But if we can assist by having other sessions that are community meetings rather than just the privileged or confidential mediation meeting. And also, if there's people with shared interests who are not part of the group that if there's people who are who have signed the mediation agreement and they have shared interests, find out what other people's interests are. That can help as well. I think it's on us to figure out timing for something more public and working with the CCC, and so that part let's work on. I think as far as in allowing the confidential mediation to include everyone, I think would not, in my professional opinion, I don't think it would work. It wouldn't yield an agreement, and it wouldn't. it wouldn't be successful as far as using everybody's time, so.
So let me take the two placards that are up briefly, and we do need to move on because we have a lot to cover in the meeting. So I've got Jane read one of them, just quick bit. So Jane.
I just want to put you on the spot and have you give us a date that you will come up with an announcement of when there can be a public input session for this.
Here. Okay. Let me talk to my team.
We'll note that as an action item.
Okay.
A quick
How about if we commit to a certain time by which we'll give you, or does anybody want input on, or?
How soon could you come back and say, we will be able to meet with the community by X? When can you come back and you can send it out to everybody? How long would that take you to sort out?
I'm out this weekend, but middle of next week.
Okay, 10 days, give or take. Okay.
November 1st.
So that's letting us know when, it's not, you'll commit to the...
There wouldn't be a session on that.
Right, but you commit to when we can have a session by that day.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jane. Reed.
Very similarly, I was asking if that was an open invitation that you would entertain a community meeting. I just met with the select board in Great Barrington. All of them were very interested and wondered when they could sit down with somebody. So I'm encouraged to hear that.
All right, thank you all for the good comments and for being responsible, at least in part. So, okay, good. All right, team, very briefly, just on the non-contested items, which are fully public, can you, Dean, just get a quick update?
Yeah, I'll do a real brief update on this, touching on the three more significant non-contested items. One of them, GE was required and submitted 2 inspection, monitoring, and maintenance plans for dams, one for Rising Pond and one for Woods Pond. We solicited comments, received a lot of comments, finalized our conditional letter to GE, required some significant revisions. That went out final, and it's for them to respond to us with a revised plan. I think it's due in December. The second major one is work.
Judy, do you have a question on that one?
Is your final online?
Yes.
But it hasn't gone out to us yet as a monthly
It
report?
has. I believe it has, but I'll check. I know I'm a little behind. I have the monthly report, remember what month we're in, for September to send out. If not, I'll send you the link to that letter.
Okay. Send that, right.
I thought I saw one. If you can keep the notes.
Are you accepting comments on the final coming back from GE?
We accept comments on all deliverables.
Next time.
The next one would be floodplain and vernal pool proposed work plans. We made more progress on the vernal pool part to take advantage of the season. That was not chemical testing. That was visual inspections of the vernal pools at various times of the year, which GE did. We think their contract did a very good job on that. What we wanted to accomplish that didn't get accomplished due to weather this year is usually in the summer you want to see if the pools shrink and dry up and are vernal. This year they were actually wetter in August and September and October than they were in the spring. So that didn't work, but we did have a 2-year program anyway, so before you can certify something as a vernal pool, it's better to know the seasonal effects. So they will do that again next year. The third one is the baseline monitoring plan, which consists of surface water, sediment, and biota. And we are still working through those.
That's for the rest of the river.
For rest of the river. All this is rest of the river. That's the topic. So we're working through those, and I don't have any update on that.
Okay. All right. Any other quick questions on those items? And we'll get that monthly update over the Lake Center.
Just for vernal pools for autumnal species that come in the autumn, that only come in the autumn, why not do an autumnal inspection?
They did, I believe, the species that Massachusetts considers for obligate species are the ones in the spring. There might be some in the fall that we will document, but again, I don't know. It's not my expertise. I don't know if the weather would have impacted that by them being wet so much this year. Jane, I don't know if you know what we expect in the fall.
I think you see marbled and...
The salamanders?
marbled salamander would be one possibility.
Yeah, we did look for the eggs. You may see the next stage, but they do look for the eggs in the spring.
Well, the marbled blaze, they're
A
in the
little-
fall, I believe.
They are later? Okay.
But you'd see the juveniles in the spring.
In the spring,
So
that's what it
spring
was.
is the time that
Okay.
typically you.
Great. Thank you, Dean. Okay, thank you all. All right, moving on from Russian
Yeah, I'm
River.
going to switch up the agenda a little bit, so I apologize. I'm going to combine, just because they're similar, air sampling data for Rising Pond, and then follow it with air data at Allendale School.
All right, here we go.
So, for Rising Pond, we had a request to do some PCB air sampling. I don't know if I'm blocking this. I apologize.
Maybe Dean, just back up just a folks. Can you guys see me?
So we met with the town, we met with, we heard your concern. So we selected 2 sampling stations on the east side of Rising Pond where we had power, access, and security. And I think it was actually 2 town facilities or stations where they had power, and they were excellent to us. They provided the gates, they upgraded the power to make sure that, or they just made sure it would work, and helped a lot. Then we were trying to find a good background station, again, where it was secure and with power. The town's recommendation, and not too close to the river, so we picked Elmwood Cemetery at the bottom of the screen. And compared to Rising Pond, it's 3 to 4 miles away. It is somewhat closer to the downstream portion of the river, but if the concern is to compare Rising Pond to something away from Rising Pond, we thought it was as good as any.
Dean, the prevalent wind is west to east?
I don't know, but I do know more. The other reason we took this is, if you can see on the picture, and certainly people in Great Barrington know, more of the residences are on the east side. You have a less obstructed area to the pond. On the west side, there's that high hill, and it's heavily forested. So I had concerns putting monitors on Van Dusen Road that typically you wouldn't put it if it's going to get blocked by the topography. And we could get a lot closer, very, very close to Rising Pond on the east side.
Okay.
The results, and I got them in a graph, and I'll try and read them. A couple things I'll point out is we did it in August, the last 2 weeks in August, so we decided to do 2 rounds. We wanted to pick a warm time of the year because that would be what we feel would be worst case absent any remediation when it's hot. To the extent PCB is volatile, it will be more when it's hot like any other compound. And the temperatures we got were in the 90s in both days. So the results are here. I'll try and put them in context. That's what's always difficult when you just get numbers. So the units are in mass per volume. So it's called micrograms per cubic meter. You can picture a big box. And the samplers run for 24 hours. So it's a sample filter and media that you're drawing air through. It's called a high volume, when you're drawing a high volume of air through this filter for 24 hours. Then you take the filter and send it to the lab. So you're measuring the volume that went through the filter, and the laboratory measures the mass of PCBs collected. So you end up with mass per volume, which is what you would expect in the air. That would be your concentration in air. The levels were, I'll just say 0.0004 to 0.0009 micrograms per cubic meter. And just generally, it's actually pretty much consistent from both rounds. The background was half of that. To try and put it into context, what we have for typical, and before I say it, because I know these are a little small, we will post these as soon as we can. And that was one of the reasons. It's not the best presentation, but it's also more of a documentation presentation so that you can look at it, later. I didn't want to do 2 things and then do a separate report. So
You're doing great.
This is better. This is also, And when I get to the other presentations, they're more detailed than I usually like to do, but they're also like a source of information, and we'll get it on the webpage. A typical GE remediation project in Pittsfield would have what's called a notification level at 0.05. That's where GE would have to notify us right away if they got data above 0.05. It doesn't mean stop work, it doesn't mean a huge health hazard, it just means we need to look at stuff. And 0.1 would be what we would call the action level, where they would have to stop work and take engineering controls. So again, 0.05 and 0.1. And I have a graph next that kind of compares these. So these are much, much lower than those levels. The other level that EPA typically uses if they're going out on a new site, it's called the screening level. So it's intended to be a very conservative screening level to help you focus on areas where the larger risk might be, or there's risk that you think you need to address. And that is 0.0049, and that's, you know, it's a published EPA level. They have them for air, water, soil, residential properties, commercial properties. So you take your data, that's why it's called a screening level. If you're below that, and they have the definition there, risk-based concentrations considered by the agency to be protected for humans, including sensitive groups, over a lifetime. It's not a cleanup level, it's just if you're below that, you don't really need to focus on that pathway anymore. That pathway, because there's a lot of pathways on a site. There's the air, residential air pathway. You know, you may have a soil level above the screening level and an air below, so then you would focus on the soil. So that's what that level is, and again, it's a lifetime level. I think it's cancer at the most conservative end of EPA's risk range, one excess cancer risk in a million. I hate using those numbers, but it's the more conservative end. So that was 0.0049, that's our level.
So Dean, both sites that were right on Rising Pond were in the same range?
Yeah, I checked that like 3 times because the numbers were identical for both of them. And one other thing I'll mention for quality control reasons, which is pretty standard, that middle column, it says co-location at the north pump station, so that's 2 monitors side by side. You can't really do what's called a split sample in air and cut the filter, because you're analyzing the whole filter. So it's co-located, and it's good that they're close. I was pretty surprised they'd be identical. So this graph just tries to put it in comparison. So the bottom is the actual data. The first lower red line is the screening level. You can see, and even I can do a little bit of math here, 9 to 49 is about 5 times lower than the screening level, and much, much lower at the top of the screen would be the action, the notification level. So my view is it's very low data, but that's just my view, and I can just show the data in some comparison with concentrations.
So it is above background, but very meaningfully below other levels that are screening and or notification.
Yeah, and those numbers are very close. But yeah, I'll just say what the data, that's what the data is. It's above the background.
I'm filling in for you because I can't. Yeah, okay. The Reed questions on that?
No, well, I guess, so so just to wrap it up in a nice, neat package, if it's 0.05, whoever the polluting party would need to alert the EPA. And if it's 0.1, that's where everything needs to stop and action needs to, everything needs to be.
That's what we set for the GE project in Pittsfield. That's not a national standard.
What is the national standard?
There is no real national standard for when you're doing work.
What's the national estimate?
I don't have it. I know New Bedford Harbor has issued, and the Hudson, they all have their own site-specific
What's the Hudson
standards.
estimate?
I don't know.
Okay.
I really
I'm just
don't.
curious to compare.
I think they're in that range. I think the Hudson's in the range of the 0.5 to 0.1.
Okay.
They're all negotiated numbers.
But they're all different.
They're all negotiated per site.
Okay.
And that's where we're at. And then I'll show the Allendale school data next, not trying to compare one to the other, but since they were similar, I will put that up
Tim,
next.
before we do that, just Tim, you got a question on this one?
Yeah, just a quick note is that years ago, EPA was telling us back around 1994 that PCBs do not get into the air. And they came out with their team and said, absolutely, this doesn't happen. It's not scientific. It's not on the board yet. And about 8 years later, all of a sudden, EPA figures out that PCBs are in the air. So a question I've been asking for years, again, which comes down to when you get results like this, is there is no actionable level to tell whether a child is safe within any PCB site on your books, on EPA books. I could find no. I've asked this question to your toxicology people, and they say there is no actionable level. So what's happening is all these kids that have lived up and down in the Housatonic River, especially the kids in Pittsfield that live near the river and possibly grew up in a contaminated home, they all are getting exposed to levels that nobody really knows. We asked this question of David Carpenter, one of the world's experts. He says nobody really knows because it's never really been studied. So we don't really know. So what do? We have our kids out here playing in sites that we don't really know. And we've had to endure that as the public because of the intensity and the toxicity of the GE site. But it's really not the right way to base, cleanup decisions on, really. I mean, you guys had 15 years now. You could have figured out that by now what's toxic. But what's the actionable level to clean up a site when there's kids on the property? So I just say that I think it's really being approached in the wrong way.
Judy, comment on this, and we'll go to Allendale.
So thank you for doing this. Thank you for putting this in place. We've been asking for this for a long time on behalf of the Rising Pond area families and the community there. Of course, I concur with what Tim says. And Reed, if you notice, 50%, it's 50% lower at the cemetery than it is right at the river, at the station. But we would have, so your children, where you're at, right across from Rising Pond, is getting exposed cumulatively to a 50% higher rate than just down the road at the cemetery. And we need to find out what their protocol is, what the monitors are, what the filters are, what lab is involved in getting these results. And with all due respect to Dean, he's a wizard engineer. He's not a toxicologist. He's not an air sampling expert. What he's done thus far is admirable, and those air monitors should stay in place, and we should advocate for as many samples as we can possibly get. And we need a toxicologist to figure this out, one who's an expert in air monitoring of chlorinated compounds.
Dean, a quick question. Is this going to be written up more than the slides in terms of this sampling, or is this kind of what we have?
That's pretty much it. There is a sampling plan that we have.
Okay, and people are going to have access to that if they want to?
Sure.
Okay. All right, Al, let's move to Allendale School.
So Allendale School, we've been doing this air sampling, I think, since 2004, 2005. So some questions were raised about why we picked July and September. We picked July again because it's hotter than the rest of the year. And we picked September because school is in session. For me, it's not really so much an issue about just the school. It's the area that's being monitored. Just because people are in school in session doesn't mean they're not on the playground, doesn't mean kids aren't playing there, doesn't mean the abutting neighborhood isn't in existence in the summer. So we do it once in the summer and once in September. And again, we got some fairly high temperatures, or at least reasonable worst case, 75 and 80 degrees. The results we got this year were 0.0002, right at the very edge of the detection limit. So that's why there's a J next to it, because it's really at the limit. The real limit of measurement here is 0.0003. So the lab can detect something, but it's right at the edge of detection. PCBs in air are ubiquitous, whether you're in Pittsfield or anywhere in the world. So there are going to be PCBs in the air no matter where you live. So that's just a fact. Again, this has the notification levels and the original action levels, as you can see, 0.05 and 0.1.
Where is the reference site?
There is no reference site here, we just do Allendale School. There's no background for this, if that's what you mean? No.
And the cemetery site, what were the levels?
Why?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, you're not going to get lower than 0.002 because you can't. Over the amount of sampling we've done, we have a lot of background data. I mean, like I said, there is no real background anyway because it's ubiquitous. If you're looking for zero, you're probably not going to find it.
Go ahead and go through.
I only have two.
Yeah, let's do this two more slides. We'll take questions from Thelma and from.
So this shows the data that we've obtained since 2007. The Hill 78 landfill had its final cap and closure. It looks like in 2009 or 2010. So again, the actual data from Allendale School is plotted on the bottom, the lower red line, and this is new. I didn't typically put this on the Allendale one, but that's our risk-based level. So if EPA went out to a new site and found this data, they would not proceed with any further action. The average over that amount of time, I think, is 0.0005. So even a simple, even I can figure it's 10 times lower than our screening level and probably 100 times lower than the notification or action level. So this just summarizes that. I guess the key one, I mean, Allendale School data is extremely low. It's 250 times below the action level we had for the project and 25 times below our screening level. And pretty similar for the last 11 years.
Thelma, you're up next.
Dean, I have a question. In regard to this air monitoring, has anybody in that area reported sicknesses or anything or at the school?
They wouldn't report it to me, so I'm not aware of it.
So if anybody was, that they thought it might be related to the PCBs, they don't report it to anybody?
I don't know what individual people will do. I haven't, nobody has reported anything to me.
Kim.
Boy, I was thinking my question about 10 minutes ago. First of all, the testing method for your tests, are you doing consumer specific or you're doing the old EPA?
We're doing the aerochlor method.
The aerochlor method. So you're doing an old method that that the detection levels are probably 0.002 or something like that before that particular type of sampling cannot detect any more PCBs in the air. It doesn't mean there are no more PCBs in the air, because if you move to congener specific, which as you know is much more costly and much more involved, you probably would have found quite a few PCBs in the parts per billion, parts per trillion range. So right there we're using an old sampling method that shouldn't be used anymore, should have been given up a long time ago. And then the other thing that has bothered me personally for years, and this started with Allendale Elementary School, and I've still never gotten the answer to the question, is that, you know, what is the action level for kids?
I don't know how many different ways I can say it. EPA's level, screening level is 0.0049. We wouldn't take any action. That's our level. You may not agree with it. You're asking for EPA's level. That would be our level where we would even start considering looking at
risk. So Dean, just say a little, so our level means EPA's national, I want to be clear about our means.
That's what it says in the definitions there. Our screening levels are considered by the agency to be protective for humans, including sensitive groups over a lifetime. So yes, that would include children. Now, I'm not saying anybody has to agree with that. That is EPA's level. That's how we do risk assessment. So,
follow up, Tim, to that before I go to Ben.
So that's all I can add to it. I mean, you have the technical assistance group, your tag contractor, you have the ability to hire a toxicologist.
Just to put it in the record, a point that was certainly made decades ago, but hasn't been discussed until tonight, in the call for a toxicologist to look at this and come up with some better understanding. I don't think you're going to find that because the number as to what's safe is constantly shifting downward. And what was considered safe at one point 5 years or 10 years later is considered way, way, way above the former safe level that's now considered a problem. So you're finding that these are all guesstimates. And those guesstimates shift with increased scientific studies and deliberations. But the HRI has, from the very beginning, suggested that the limits and the idea for what is safe is something that is really only a guess, and it's a guess based in time, so that guess changes. And so the relative security that one could take away knowing that a certain amount is considered well below an action level is again a somewhat arbitrary and meaningless distinction, because we've learned that what traditionally was the method that a certain amount needed to occur in order to trigger negative health effects, we're finding that lower and lower levels are in fact able to create the most serious and lasting transgenerational effects. And it's not necessarily about how much, but when you're exposed and what that exposure triggers, especially in utero, especially for young children. So I just wanted to again bring that into the discussion. In looking for a toxicologist to either satisfy or challenge any assumptions, you're not going to get a definitive answer. And we've always suggested that no PCBs is really where you'd like to be. And the fewer PCBs that are around, the better everyone is for. So that's been our position from the very beginning, pushing for the most extensive cleanup that we can have. Those ideals or ideas have not been embraced by government agencies.
Just two things, which is the first, I wanted to say thank you very much to Dean, Tim, and I remember meeting with Jim, who came to my house, and we talked about air monitors. I do appreciate the efforts there, despite the fact that, yes, we are breathing PCBs. It's nice to know just how much I'm breathing. And now I would like to know if it's possible that, you know, there would be any, as Judy had said, possibility of continuing any air monitoring or creating a cumulative air monitor there, so that we might better understand what exactly we're getting into, you know, rather than changing the filter, seeing what you know, getting some different data. Would that be a possibility? Again, I appreciate you working with us.
I mean, we'll definitely consider it. I mean, we can talk separately. I'm not sure I fully understand your question about changing the filter or cumulative
The
thing.
filters are still there?
No, you take, you mail the filter into the lab and it gets destroyed. So if you do another sampling round, you get new filters from labs.
Okay, and how long are the, again, sorry for my ignorance.
No problem.
How long are the filters there as to?
It's a 24-hour sample. It runs for 24 hours, so you put the filter in. There's actually two filters. One collects particulates, one is the polyurethane foam that would get more of the aerosol or the vapor.
Got it.
So you take that, you run it through, you run air, you pull it through like a vacuum cleaner. If you can get a picture, you're pulling the air through the filters. After the 24 hours, you measure, you watch your flow meter, you measure, or you record, excuse me, the volume of air that went through. You take the filters, you send them to a lab. They do the analysis and they report the result.
Okay.
So it's a one-time use filter.
And do they have filters that last a month?
I don't think it's a question of the filters lasting a month. I think it's how long would you run the air through it. I'm unaware of one being run for more than 24 hours.
So if it was run for 24 hours, then are the amounts of PCBs that I am breathing cumulative over, that's 24 hours, so 365 times 24 hours?
I think I would consider that your average concentration on a day with that type of temperature. So I would expect if we did them in January, it would be lower. So I'm not sure I'm asking if it's like a mass, I don't want to get too technical. I think that's the concentration that would be there that day. If you're there for 8 hours, you breathe in 8 hours of that milligrams.
I live there, so
so you would assume you're there 24 hours, but.
I'm kind of curious.
So let me just be clear, are you asking for periodic monitoring like Allendale School or something different?
I'm asking for periodic monitoring so I could get an idea of just how much, because I'm not the only person that lives there. And so I think there's a lot of people that live right by the river, near Rising Pond, the potential site of the PCB dump that GE wants to put there ridiculously, that would like to know just how much over the year they're accumulating in their body. Thanks.
Okay, and I think, you know, with regard to these levels, these are the two stations we have. I think it would be good if you're really concerned about what you're getting here, and again, others can do it, is PCBs are pretty ubiquitous if you look in other areas of the country.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know exactly what they are, but these are extremely low.
Okay.
That's about all I'll say.
So I think as an action item, though, I think you've requested, is it possible to do this periodically?
We'll bring it back.
Okay.
Think about it.
Sure.
Okay, great.
Dennis, final word on this, we'll go to the next presentation.
Yeah, just a point of clarification, or any misunderstanding here. The filter itself it's a unit or a box that's sucking in the air through the actual filter, correct?
It's a filter or a box. Hold on one second.
I think you could call the filter box a filter.
The unit itself, so there's a unit itself, a casing, if you want to call it. To me, it looks like a birdhouse. It's about 3 feet high. It's a metal case. There's an exhaust hose and there's a pump that pumps it through it. So sometimes you may see the units will stay in place because we don't want to, like in between these two events, we didn't take the units away because you have to calibrate the pump, you have to do a lot of stuff. So you will see that unit, but there won't be a filter in there.
Yeah.
The actual filter will only be there for 24 hours. That's a good clarification.
Okay.
So Allendale's air monitors are there all the time, right?
They're put up in July. I think since we go July and September, I don't recall if we leave them up in that duration, but certainly after September we take them down.
And then Rising Pond is already down?
They're the same units, so we actually took the ones we did Allendale in July, used the units, the sampling unit in Rising Pond in August, brought them back, recalibrated them in September at the school, and they're probably in our warehouse right now.
Do you think it's indicated for Rising Pond to air monitor during rest of river removal actions?
I think that's certainly the intent, and hopefully we will get there.
When you did the 1.5, was there air
that is our intent, but yeah.
When you did the 1.5 during dredging and the like, was there?
Yeah, every project has had PCB air sampling during the project.
Yeah.
So that's what I was talking about, those project-specific action levels. Those are when you're during a project. You know, you want to compare the data, are things changing while you're working.
So even if a removal action is happening north of Rising Pond, you'll monitor at Rising Pond?
No, I didn't say that. You said if you're working in Rising Pond. We certainly don't have our air monitoring plan finalized yet. We don't even have a remedy finalized yet. The intent is to do sufficient air monitoring.
I'd like to request that if you are cleaning up someplace above Rising Pond, that we have air monitoring at Rising Pond. We're a dam also. Thank you.
Okay, Lord.
Just so everybody can understand, so right now, there's work being done at the old GE site near Silver Lake, and there's an air monitoring system right there at Mountain One, yes? Is that the same type of, if people are interested, would that be the same thing that people could see?
Yeah, so what is going on at the GE, so there's no soil remediation going on at the GE plant site.
Right.
What is going on at the former GE site, which is now owned by the Pittsfield Economic Development Authority, or PETA, is the construction of a new building. So the state, John Ziegler and I have been working with PETA on that. They were doing some soil handling to put the foundation in, and we thought it'd be advisable to collect some PCB air data. So that's what you're seeing. We're just saying by Mountain One. I believe there's one by Mountain One.
Yeah, there's one by Mountain One, there's one on the opposite side of where the construction is in a downwind location, and then there's one to the north also.
So if people were interested, that's sort of how it works.
That is typically how we would do it. We try to, you try to use at least three on three different sides, excuse me. Use three.
Good, thanks.
All right, good. So we're going to move on to chlorobenzene.
Yeah, so we'll try chlorobenzene. So I switched the agenda around a little bit. This was, I think, a request from a CCC member to talk about groundwater and groundwater standards. So I will do my best to try to explain it, because it involves a couple definitions, which usually I don't like to put very wordy slides up. But it's important, so if you, again, it doesn't all have to sink in now, so I'll try and point out the key things. This is from the consent decree. So we have what's called groundwater performance standards for surface water. And what we're talking about here is just what's called GW3, which is protection of surface water, excuse me. There's other standards that we'll get to when we do talk about the landfills. So what the consent decree said is where there's wells that are designated, there's a lot of wells at this site, there might be 100. They're not all what's called compliance wells. So for surface water, we have what's called compliance wells, which are near surface water. So you want to get as close to the surface water as you can. So that's a key point. So the standard is measured at the compliance well. It's either what's called the Method 1 groundwater standard, which is a state standard that we adopted. I call it like a default standard. It's a published standard. So you compare it to that. And then the other key thing is if it exceeds that, the standard has, or develop an alternate risk-based standard. So that is the overall performance standard. 3 components. It has to be a compliance well. If it exceeds the default standard, then GE has the option to propose a risk-based standard. And I can go, and I'm just going to leave this here. I don't really need to get into it, but it's all from the consent decree and statement of work. We essentially adopted most of the state regs. There's a couple, there might be a couple minor modifications, but that's what it is. So that the consent decree says, go ahead.
Can you just explain what the GMA?
Oh yeah, I knew I had that in my notes. The site is so big that we broke it into 5 groundwater management areas. And there's other reasons to do that because there are different soil cleanups in each area. So the other thing the consent decree says is when do you look at this data? Well, you're collecting it all along, but once the soil remediation is complete, then you look at the long-term trends. Did they decrease after the soil remediation? So you can monitor, GE is allowed to monitor for another 2 years. The 2 years were up in one area called, which is next to the Housatonic River south of East Street, called GMA1. So they were still exceeding the method 1 standard for one compound, fluorobenzene. And at Uncomet Brook area, which is a big area, if you remember, we talked about that a lot. We just recently completed the remediation. We actually had GE not even wait the 2 years and said, we don't think it's going to drop below that in 2 years. So they exceed the default standard in 2 locations of the site. One is in the Uncomet Brook area, which we call GMA3, and one is near the Housatonic River, which we call GMA1. So again, in compliance with the consent decree, so GE's over these levels, they proposed a work plan to do a site-specific, to develop a site-specific standard.
For risk-based.
Risk-based, site-specific standard. And the risk here is an ecological risk, not for human health. So that's what GE is doing right now. They are in the process of doing sampling.
Dean, what's a pour water, P-O-R?
Okay, we'll get to, yeah.
Good, ask away.
Very good.
You put up the word, it's fair to ask.
So, all right. So GE's, first of all, I'll go in order, that'll help me. So they're doing 5 rounds of sampling. So what GE is currently measuring, or what they have been measuring, is concentration in a groundwater well. So it's a well close to the surface water. It's measuring, you put a well and you put a screen, water comes in the screen and you sample it. That water is going to flow towards the river, usually 99% of the time, towards the water body, underground, come up through the bottom of the sediment and into the surface water of the river. So pour water refers to the interstitial, or the space in the sediment where water gathers, but it's kind of below, it'd be like below your feet if it was on ground. So it's where we think the water is discharging in, where we think groundwater is discharging into the surface water. So GE is measuring the well, a nearby spot in the surface water, both the pore water and the surface water directly above that sediment, if you want to call it a sediment sample, water and sediment. And so it's 3 things that are linked. So that's the on-site collection of data. Then GE has to do the research and research toxicity on different compounds. EPA has some databases that they can use. So it's a 2-step process. 1, collecting analytical data, and 2, doing research.
And when is this period of time when it is doing this activity is from when to when?
We're getting into that.
Sorry.
You know?
Just trying to help you.
A couple more slides. So they need to develop a risk-based target fluorobenzene, and the goal here is if you think there's a risk in the river, can you set a standard in the well? Right now, the level they're looking at, I'll just use an arbitrary number of 1. You know, would 3 be protected? Because we want to keep monitoring the groundwater. That's our point of compliance. So, but they're measuring all 3 right now. Okay.
Hang on just one second. I want to get Barbara, Judy, Valerie, and then Benno. So, are you ready for questions? Or you want to
if I could just do a few more, and then I think maybe I ran.
1 or 2 more, then I'll get.
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot of slides on this one. So then at the end of the sampling, GE has to propose to EPA for review the site-specific standard. So this is the area south of East Street between Newell and Lyman Street, where GE had a lot of manufacturing facilities.
Is that all sheet piling in green?
Those are sheet pile walls that I was there when they put them in 1999 to 2000. So yes, those are sheet pile walls.
The green is sheet pile.
Yes, sheet pile walls. So there's 2 wells. Let's see if I can work my fancy pointer here. I'll probably screw it up. You got a real one, Pat? But what I want to try and point out, if I can, if not, there are 2 wells with exceedances, so I think this is one well that was above that standard, and this is the other one that's above the standard. So GE's going to sample the 2 wells, and here are 8 sample locations in the river. This is the flowing river down here.
Forgive me, but where's Newell Street parking lot? Where
Opposite side of the river. This is on the north side of the Housatonic River between East Street Lyman Street and Newell Street. So the Newell Street parking lot would be south of this. Actually, you can barely see the old lines of the parking lot is here. This is Newell Street parking lot.
On the other side?
The other
Okay.
side of this, we're on the north side.
All right.
So G is gonna sample pore water and sediment right here, right here, and all these spots. So you can see they're close to where the wells are. So we're trying to get a correlation between the groundwater. That's kind of the end game. Correlation between the groundwater and the surface water, and is what's in the groundwater discharging stuff that poses an unacceptable risk in the surface water. So that is the map for that area. Uncommit Brook, very similar. There were 4 wells. I'll just try and do it briefly. There were 4 wells that exceeded, that one up there, and then more so down near where the brook discharges into the river. So same scenario where you're sampling the well, the pore water, and the surface water of the brook. And then G's also doing upstream sampling in the Housatonic River, upstream of, if I can call it a confluence, or upstream of the discharge of Uncommit Brook, and then downstream. So they're doing that for at least 5 events. So we don't do just a one and done. They started in early September. We may be done in December. I think what our team is looking for is a variety of conditions. High flow in the brook, low flow in the brook and the river aren't always the same. Temperature conditions. So it may go into next year. That's kind of the bottom line here. Okay, put that in here. So sampling may go into next year. So the report will be submitted 60 days after the final sampling event. So just top of trees. We're following the process in the decree. GE will submit a proposal to EPA when they're done. These reports are not very long. They're only about 10 pages if you want to read them. So I have the links here, and we'll get this on the webpage as soon as we can.
Okay.
And the actual language is a little harder, but there is a link to the consent decree. But if somebody wants the actual language, I should be able to get it to them.
Barbara, Judy, Valerie.
Okay, I have 2 questions. So we know that PCBs bind to soil when they get the chance. Do chlorobenzene do the same thing?
I would think they'd be a little more soluble in water, or they are more
But you
soluble
are
in
still
water.
testing the sediment just to be sure.
We are testing the sediment for, what we're testing is the pore water in the sediment. So the sample that goes to the lab is a liquid. It's
But it
not,
has
it's
some-
not a solid sediment.
It has some sediment suspended in it?
What it is, if you can kind of picture, that's why it's called, it's a pore water bag or a diffusion bag. It's like a plastic bag, but it allows water to go in, but not solid.
So it sits in that area, but
So it
essentially
sits in
dirt
that
can't come
area,
in,
dirt
water
can't come in, water come in. It's trying to measure what's being discharged from groundwater to surface water. And the other reason we picked that, excuse me, I'll get back to this guys, is that's where the benthic organisms are. So we don't want to, especially in the Housatonic River, it's going to get diluted as it goes into the main stem and you have a lot of water flow. We wanted to know what is the kind of the chlorobenzene concentration in water in the sediment, if that makes any sense. Because it'll be, that's where your benthic organisms are. That's what they're exposed to. They're not exposed to the surface water. The consent decree is pretty clear. They got to address risk in biota in sediment.
Are you concerned that it's going to widely contaminate the sediment in the cleaned portion of the river?
Since it is soluble, I don't think our concern is on the chlorobenzene contaminating the sediment. I think it's more of a water and an ecological risk.
What about the people, the human beings that use the water, use the river for recreation?
That's not a risk pathway, I think, that we're concerned with. I think it's more of an ecological risk.
Okay, and my second separate question is, was this not done before? One of your slides said, establish, yeah, you just went to it. Establish site specific standards or something like that.
Was this not done before? So
why are we doing this now instead of preempting?
Very good question. So what the consent decree has, we adopted the mass standards. So there's a table of all the method 1 standards for about 200 compounds. So GE over the years has been comparing it to that standard. So we have been gathering the data over the years. The middle paragraph says, when we really evaluate compliance with this standard is after the soil remediation is complete. The theory being, and whether this is true or not, if you remove if that was a source of the groundwater contamination, you remediate it, you would see groundwater concentrations go down. And then you would decide, maybe it would go below the standard. These did not. The soil remediations were both relatively recently completed. So that is why now GE is looking at the alternate standard.
Because they exceeded
the standard, and the time is now when you do the comparison for compliance. So they've been sampling these for 20 years.
Judy.
So why, you're just talking about benzene components, or specifically chlorobenzene.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm seeing exceedances for trichloroethylene, toluene, acetone, some cadmium, tetrachloroethylene, and 2-butanone.
Okay.
Now, that's more in the APCA area?
That's what we'll get to next.
That's next.
This area here, so I think this area here, the only compound in both what's called GMA1 and GMA3 that exceeded the standard, the default standard, was chlorobenzene. Those other compounds you mentioned were all lower than the default standard in these two areas.
Well, we're going to get to another area where
Even though they exceed?
No, they don't exceed. I don't know what you're looking at, so I can't answer it.
But can you just be clear for a second here, there are exceeds of other things, maybe what you mentioned at another GMA?
We're going to talk about another GMA with concentration.
This is at APCA. This
Right,
is at 71.
Right, so that, yes, but
we'll get to that.
With regard to this area, these two areas, the only exceedance is chlorobenzene.
So can you tell me, Pittsfield Generating Company, they have access to the groundwater through an easement with General Electric?
That will be my next presentation. So did you have any, I'm fine to do those questions, but did you have any more on those two? Because that's what the next part is.
So what we're seeing is an exceedance. Does that indicate to you movement? Movement of
yes, absolutely. The chlorobenzene is moving and discharging to the river. The question is it a significant risk? That's what we're trying to answer. So yes.
And they're not going to base anything on human exposure. Only.
It's not them. It's
eco.
What the standard is based on. The GW1 default standard that's being exceeded is an ecologically based standard.
They're not exceeding a human health standard.
As far as I know, there may not even, right.
So
nobody's drinking the water, and it's just not a pathway for a human risk.
They're not mandated to consider human risk.
They're mandated to compare to the standard, and the standard for chlorobenzene is ecological, the state standard. That's my understanding.
John, is that correct? John, is there also a human health standard for chlorobenzene as well?
Well, there is for a drinking water exposure.
Right.
But you're saying you're not drinking this.
But here, this is a surface water discharge. So the pathway of concern is to an aquatic organism. And so that's what the standard is that's what you're comparing to. That GW3 standard is based on ecological risk-based standards. And that's how DEP develops their standard. They use a very conservative generic site. And in our risk assessment, people are allowed to develop a site-specific standard based on their own site data because they may not fit that generic model. So our method 1 standards are considered very, very protective, conservative, and people have the option of developing another standard based on their site data, and that's what GE is intending to do through this additional standard.
When Susan Svirsky, the scientist at the site, the one who got thrown under the bus, when she put clams into the river right in that area, I believe, do you remember any of that data? that was compiled
if
on
we did
the
do
freshwater
plans,
plans?
if she did it for the rest of the river, I'm not aware of it being a risk because chlorobenzene was not determined to be a contaminant of concern in the rest of the river. I don't know what she monitored the mussels for.
No.
I know I monitored them for PCBs. But when we did the remediation in the mile and a half.
So do you follow up question when you did
But I don't have a recollection if there was chlorobenzene
So let's
collected in the mussels.
Let's get the placards that are up and then we'll come back to the other side. So Valerie's next.
I'm glad you mentioned Hill 78 and 1, because I thought this was going to be about that, but you're
That's what we're gonna do right now.
Later, okay, good.
Well, later would be now, once we get done with the
Now, after,
question.
okay. So what's chlorobenzene? What is that?
What is it?
And what does it do to you?
What would you use for?
I was just focusing on what they need to do. I know what it is. It's a benzene ring with a chlorine on it. You asked what it was. It's one of the many chemicals.
It's carcinogenic?
I would assume so, yes.
Tim, do you have a quick thought on what this is?
GE used I used to know it as dichlorobenzene, but we're probably talking
That's because
about
it's a
the same.
different compound. A chlorobenzene would have one. They used to use trichlorobenzenes to cut the PCBs because PCBs were too thick.
Right.
This area, in the Arcomet Brook area, was also GE Plastics. So
might have been plastic.
I didn't even bother trying to research where it came from because it's there.
But it is a carcinogen?
I would have to check, but that would be my
Probably,
assumption.
okay. And does it volatilize in the air?
Anything does. It's less volatile than gasoline, but it will. All compounds volatilize.
Okay. So when you did the air monitoring, we just went through it, Allendale, that was only for PCBs, not
Correct.
for other compounds or
Correct.
anything?
That's
So there
correct,
could be other toxic materials that we wouldn't have known about because they're not tested in the air.
We tested for PCBs, that's correct.
Only PCBs, okay, thank you.
Ben, do you have a follow on or you all set?
No, it's, sort of, in passing, you sort of didn't answer the question that I was going to ask, which is, where does this come from and why is it there?
I think I know the source area, which would be what was called GE's Waste Stabilization Basin. That's where they discharged a lot of liquid chemicals.
Where's that? Is that
It had something to do with plastics.
We'll have to go back and if I can figure that
So that's the
out.
one under the Sabic parking lot?
No, that's not the one. That is a different landfill. There's an area south of that, which was called the Waste Stabilization Basin, which I believe is on that figure, if I
Just
can
get
get
the
back
time,
to it.
just for time.
Yeah.
I know people are anxious to hear about this.
And this one's even more
So
complicated.
let me get to Jane's question and then let's get to this so because I know people are anxious to hear about it. So Jane.
I guess my real question is, we know that this stuff is moving into the river and continuing to move into the river. Why are we wasting time on characterizing level of risk instead of stopping it?
Because that's what the CD says. I know you don't like that answer, but.
And if it
that's
does
what
exceed at risk levels, then there has to be a discussion about action or prevention, as Jane just said. All right, let's get to OPCA.
Okay, so some of the terms will be the same, that's why I wanted to do that one first. So as Jim mentioned and he talked about, I probably should have started with a figure, but I'll get to a figure in a little bit. The groundwater areas. So we have two overlapping areas now. We have what's called the APCA, the landfill groundwater monitoring wells, the 12 wells that ring the landfill. That is in a bigger area called GMA4. So there's a total of, since they're co-located essentially, GE submits one report. It's called the APCA Post-Closure Groundwater Monitoring Plan. So that is the basis for that is the plan that they have to follow. Sampling's required in the spring and the fall. And like I said, since they're overlapping, they give us one report for those, which are technically two different areas, or two different requirements. The reports usually come in the winter and the summer. I think this one came in July. So these were some of the concerns that I read about in the paper, so I figured I'd use that as the basis to do the presentation. Potential threat to Allendale School, kind of unspecified if it was water or air. Impact to the Housatonic River. There's something which is even more confusing that we talked about for surface water. It's called benchmarks, which are not performance standards, but they're benchmarks. And then are trends increasing or decreasing? So try and take them one at a time. And after each one of these four, we certainly can do questions. And again, there's way more slides than I would normally present. So some of this we already talked about. The standards that we use pretty much came from the mass contingency plan. Semi-annual sampling, again, a little redundant. So 12 each time around the APCA and 4 other ones. So here's the figure. I think I have to reactivate this. The ones in yellow are what's called, if you can see the yellow, I don't know how the lighting is here. They ring the landfill, you can kind of see that. They go right around the landfill. There's 12 of them. Those are called the APCA monitoring wells. This whole big purple area is referred to as GMA4. So there's numerous other wells in that area that got monitored over time. The 4 that we're still concerned with are these 4 here, these blue ones. This one's actually south of that. I'll talk about why that one's there now too. So those are the 16 wells that now get sampled every 6 months.
So can you
Go back
just, for the people and to refresh all of us, just speak the acronym APCA, what it means, the TSCA level versus Hill 78, and show me those again.
And show us where Allendale School is.
Yeah, here's Allendale School, up here. Here is Tyler Street Extension. This dashed line is the landfills or APCAs, whatever term you prefer.
APCA stands for what?
On plant consolidation area, because there was material brought there as part of the thing.
Is that APCA 71, or is that both?
That is both. They abut each other. If you're standing on them, you have no idea where the line is unless you see the signs. About right here, not perfect. To the left of it is Hill 78 landfill. To the right of it is Building 70. It's called the Building 71 landfill or APCA.
Okay, and the APCA and 71 is high level, federal TSCA level regulated lined landfill, right?
Correct. There's 2 situations here. This was Hill 78 was the landfill that existed prior to the consent decree, so it was an unlined landfill.
Unlined.
Additional material was allowed to be was placed there, which was not TSCA or less than 50 ppm waste.
How many cubic yards went in there? I've forgotten.
They're about 125,000 each. I just used that as a rough number. So
Okay.
250,000 total, and it included building debris. To the right is a new landfill, newly constructed landfill with a bottom liner that collects leachate. And that consent decree does say did receive waste with PCBs above 50 parts per million.
So really high concentration PCBs.
Greater than 50, yep. The cutoff was 50. So those are the wells. Well, why are we monitoring groundwater? There's 3, and this again comes from the state, but it makes sense. MCP GW1 is designed to be protective of drinking water. So if you have a drinking water well near this and you have a monitoring well, you want to make sure it's protective of drinking water. And I'll go into more on each of these. GW2, so we talk about compounds volatilizing off of water. The risk, at least in the MCP and what EPA adopted, is if you're close to a building, if you're shallow groundwater near a building, there's a potential for compounds to volatilize off and get into a building. That's the GW2 standard. That's what that's designed to be protective. Human health from vapors into the building. which actually happens in a lot of our sites. And GW3, which we already talked about, is protection of surface water. So you got 3 different levels that you can compare against. For this site, there's no drinking water in the area. So we don't even have the GW1 tables. If you're looking at the data, you won't even see GW1 written down. There's no comparison because there's no drinking water. So the first was a concern about Allendale School. Well, if you remember the picture I had, which I think I showed again, there's 3 wells between Allendale School and the landfills. All 3 wells, the last round, were non-detect for, I'll use the term PCE, which is really tetrachloroethylene, but the trade name is PCE. So if you see them both on that table, that's why I don't like PCE, that's an old trade name. That's what you use, that's what dry cleaner fluid is. It's called a PERC. But if you're looking at a table and you see you won't see PCE. So it's tetrachloroethylene or PCE, and the other compound of concern that I heard about was trichloroethylene, which is a different compound called TCE. So all 3 were NB in 2018. So since those wells have been sampled twice a year, for as long as the wells have been in existence, 2 of the wells have been in there for 18 years and 1 for 12. So that's 24 to 36 times. For 2 of those wells, PCE and TCE have never been detected. Only once, 1 well, PCE, tetrachloroethylene was detected, 1 time in 24 events, 25 times lower than the default GW2 standard, which isn't applicable anyway because there's no buildings there, and 40,000 times lower than that. So,
Why do I have in my hand a graph of PCE,
what's the name of the well on the top?
GMA 4-9?
We didn't get to that well yet.
Okay.
Okay, so the wells between the landfill and Allendale School have almost entirely
These 3
the non-detect.
are all non-detect.
Okay.
And the second component, the groundwater flows away from Allendale School.
Say again, the what?
The groundwater flow, the direction of groundwater,
Yeah.
like Jamie was saying, groundwater flows, typically flows towards the river, which is to the south. So you have no contamination. Not only do you have no contamination, the flow is away from the school. There's no threat to the school. No contamination, no migration.
I think that's a pretty like
broad statement.
Statement.
I would say
with a city whose groundwater is completely contaminated, that it's been written off the books. To say that there's absolutely no threat to that.
Based on the data, I will say based on the data,
Okay.
there is no threat, if you want me to qualify it.
Okay. All right, Tim, do you want to pause on this one, or can we actually keep going?
Yeah, Dean, my concern has always been, as we look at these samples from the wells that are, how deep are they, 30 feet or something like that?
Each one's different, depends how deep the groundwater
So how
is.
deep do they
Sometimes you
go?
got perched groundwater, some of them are much deeper, I don't know the depth. I know some are below 15 feet, because that's where the GW2 standard kicks in. So I know the water table's below 15 feet in a lot of days.
So Hill 78, if you read the 1988 site assessment that you guys wrote, it basically states that that GE had dumped into this 70-foot ravine, which was Hill 78 before it became before it was ravine, nothing, it didn't have a number, and then when it became a hill, it was, but we had this, so now we have this ravine that's super highly contaminated down there from everything that I've read, open to the groundwater of Pittsfield, as is everything that is below the depth of your sampling wells.
I would say there is groundwater contamination in this area. If that's
So my concern has always been, and I don't think this has ever been sampling, my question is, have you guys ever thought about this or sampled it? Is the groundwater of Pittsfield, let's say, interacting with the groundwater in Lenox, or interacting with the groundwater in Lee? Is this traveling through our aquifer?
Where it will travel is to the surface water. I don't think it would travel 15 miles down to Lee. The flow will be to the surface water, perpendicular to the river, The river's down here. Groundwater flows to the river and it'll discharge to the river. So to the extent the contamination would get to leak, it would be via the surface water.
Let's maybe keep going for a bit. We'll see if there's other questions.
So we got through Allendale. Darn it. We'll try that. Surface water we talked about a little bit already. So we know there's a standard, there's a default standard, there's a point of compliance, and then there's an option to do an alternative standard. So for the 16 wells, even though they're not really points of compliance, because they're not close to the river, we can still use that to me as a guideline, as an FYI. There have been 0 exceedances of the GW3 standard for PCE and TCE. There's never been an exceedance. So that's just the data. I'm not drawing any conclusions. That's just take the data, compare it to the number. So there hasn't been any. So this is just a graph of that, and these are some of the graphs that you're talking about, Judy. So these were not in the report. I had GE generate these because I wanted to show this GW3 standard. In general, there's 4 wells that have shown these compounds, 3 wells that have shown these compounds regularly. One of them happens to have both PCE and TCE. I think it's called 1. If it's on here, MW1. This particular one, I think I can find the well.
MW1RR?
That's it. That's the one with the most contamination in it. So, right. 1RR. So that is an Opca well. It's close to the Opca. It's a deep well. Here's the contamination since 2006. Fairly consistent, maybe a little downward trend, but consistent. High, but nowhere near a GW3, high as compared to 0, nowhere near a GW3 standard. Same graph, 1RR for TCE.
And different states within the United States have different benchmarks, have different groundwater standards.
I have no idea what any other state in this country has.
Yes, they do.
So I assume they all might have different standards. So for this one, you can kind of just graphically see it's barely even measurable compared to the GW3 standard. So similar for the other 2 wells. So I skipped over somehow magically. So these 4, and I'll talk about these other wells, Hill 78 or H7816 and 4-9, which are downgraded in the Opca, again, relative to the GW3 standard, over time, are nowhere near it. So our conclusion is it's not a GW3, there's no, based on the data, there's no threat of those compounds to surface.
Maybe let's get to this next few slides and we can see if there's questions.
This is the one that I think caused the confusion.
Okay.
So GE also reports against what's called the GW2 level. Now this is right out of the consent decree. So groundwater, the GW2 level that everybody's measuring to is for protection of vapors getting into houses or basements. So in order for that to be applicable, the well has to be within 50 feet laterally of the building, so close to the building, and the groundwater has to be shallow, 15 feet or less. If that's the case, then the performance standard is applicable. If it's not, the well is deeper, the well is nowhere near a occupied building, it's not an applicable standard. So GE did not want to compare any of the data to a non-applicable standard, and we said we have to have something. What if somebody puts a building in later? How do we know, should we monitor that well for migration, downgrading, where there might be a building? So we said, you're going to put it in there and you're going to call it a benchmark. You're going to compare it to a benchmark. And that was even in effect in 1999. So just for point of reference, not for compliance, not for a corrective action. So it's pretty much the same thing. So that was the consent decree, and this got carried over in the final work plan in 2011. GE will compare the sampling data to all Opca wells to the GW2 standards as a benchmark. So not as a standard that you exceed, you have to correct. So in the spring, there still were no exceedances of the GW2 standard. There were no exceedances of the performance standard because in the wells that had exceeded the benchmarks, the standard was not applicable. And that's the part that I think is causing the confusion.
Say that one more time. That was really confusing.
That's the confusing. So you have this level, a GW2 level. It's, I don't know, 30.
Okay.
It's only applicable if you're near a building.
Okay.
We told GE to compare all well data to that number.
Whether it's near a building.
Whether it's near a building or not.
Okay.
There are no exceedances for the wells near the buildings.
Okay.
There were exceedances of what we call the benchmarks.
But not near a building.
But not near buildings. Those exceedances are not new. They've been going on since the applicant's been there.
So
and before.
So benchmarks were really geared towards near buildings. Is that correct?
Benchmarks, no, the standard is near buildings.
Okay.
Benchmarks is, what are you going to do with the data? I got to compare it to something. I don't want to compare it to nothing because then those wells told you they'd be kind of useless. What are we monitoring
This
for?
group has been around a long time and is very smart, and I think this definitely, I've seen more quizzical looks than I've seen in a long time.
So,
okay, so
again, this is the data, and yeah, they're above benchmarks. They have been since 2008 in 1WRR, and they still are.
So let me take some questions if I could. So Thelma, you had your question first.
Dean, have they ever detected, if they've monitored inside the school, was there ever a problem with monitoring inside the school that they detected anything?
The only sampling inside the school has been for PCBs. Since we think the groundwater is going away from the school and the groundwater data between the landfills and the school is essentially non-detect, there's no real, the data doesn't give you a reason to go sample inside the school.
So they don't ever think...
We do not do indoor air sampling in that school or any other school.
And because I keep going back to this issue, naturally it's harmful to the people, and for all those years that people were attending the school, and I know for a perfect fact that some people, I know a teacher that died from getting cancer, and how do you know what it was from?
I don't know what it was from.
Okay, that's why I keep wondering why they don't have what's affecting the people in that area or in that school.
Well, I won't get into why people get cancer, but there's, I think 1 in 4 get cancer, so there's more than one source.
Oh.
So back to the data.
Somebody else was above.
Okay.
We'll go if there's a question now.
We'll go Jane, Tim.
I just, first of all, would like to thank you for creating the benchmark that shows us that, yes, we do have contamination that will continue going
Continue to
our
migrate.
Because
Right. So the next 4 are just more for, just to have there when you have the PDF if you want to look at it and you don't want to go through the 300-page report. That one well, it went in October 2008. I don't know what it was before. I think there was a perched water table there before and the well was fouled, so we said put a new well in. It went deeper and it had these levels. So they are above the benchmark. This one well, which is southwest of the Apca, is above the benchmark for both PCE and TCE.
but not above the,
Not above the GW3. And then these are the 2 down gradient wells, which are also above, but again, if I can, I'll have to get to the figure, but they're not near a building.
Judy.
So you just went by the slide that I had a question about. This is well H78B-16 for trichloroethylene.
TCE, yep.
So this has been was sunk in September of '96?
Correct, and you'll see in 1996, before the APCAs, they exceeded GW2 standards.
Right, so what's going on with this spike in November of 17? A lot of these components seem to be, some of them have all gradually come down, which is expected. But now I'm seeing spikes.
There was an elevated hit. That's the interesting part. That didn't even get in the paper because it was in last year's report. But sometimes they go up, sometimes they go down. You see the yellow is a new sampling method. These wells don't generate a lot of water. They're very hard when you purge them. You like to purge what's in there and have water flow back in. This is called a very slow recharging well. So we switched the method per EPA guidance to what's called a a diffusive bag, so similar to what we're putting in the river. So you put the bag in and let it sit for a couple of weeks, then take it out. One reason maybe it's a different method, but you'll see in the spring for this well, for whatever reason, it seems to be lower, and in the fall, it seems to be higher. So in the spring, this spring, it was non-detect. I don't know why it went up in the fall or why it went down in the spring. I do know there's contamination in that well, but it's not above an actionable standard. That's why we're watching.
So can we talk now about Pittsfield Generating Company?
We're getting there.
Okay. And are you going to address PCDDs and PCDFs also?
No, I wasn't planning on it, but we can.
Because
so one well had an increase, this was in the paper, one well, 4.9, did have an increase this year. I think GE said compared to last year, it was non-detect, it's 0.12. There was a concern that this well in general was having an overall increase, increasing trend. There's the overall data since 2009. Again, sometimes it goes up, sometimes it goes down. I don't see any trends there.
So Dean, just a quick interruption. So just to be aware, I think we're still engaged and people have more to talk through. It's 7:30, so I just want to note that, and I assume we can keep going. Everybody's okay with that?
I'll do whatever you want. So, I don't think there's increasing trends in this area. That's how I see the graphs. People can see the graphs differently. There was an increase. The concern in the paper by somebody was raised relative to just one other data point that there was an increase. That was factually correct. From November 17 to May 18, it did go up. But over 10 years, it's relatively stable.
So Dean, just because in this well, it's actually the opposite spring fall, but you see.
Yeah, this one's opposite, and don't ask me.
We don't know why the seasonality of some of these hits.
I don't.
And there's no evidence in the area of any plumes?
I don't know what you mean by plume. This is a groundwater plume, so yes, this is a plume. It's not a free phase NAPL plume, which we talk about sometimes, where there's actual product. This is dissolved. It's dissolved contamination in groundwater. And if you connect the two wells, you can call it a plume. You draw a circle around it.
These are all VOCs. I mean, they're highly volatile.
That's right. That's why the GW2 standard is low.
Because Barbara just said, I mean, is it possible that this could be another uncharacterized barrel site? Like where Hill 78 is?
As Tim said, they've been dumping here since the 30s.
So a barrel let loose, that could.
There's been probably groundwater contamination since the 30s. I only have data since 1996, and there's groundwater contamination in 1996.
Dennis, question?
Yeah, it's terrible data. I mean, it's
just contaminated groundwater. There is. I mean, there's no sugarcoating that.
Exactly. And it's not a surprise, but what is the action plan now?
The action plan is to keep monitoring it and making sure there's no significant increase, and that there's mainly the real concern is, will it migrate down here to this area such that it would be an issue to the surface water or to an indoor air building?
Wouldn't an action plan be getting ahead of the curve and not get it before it's down to the river?
Not if they're complying with all the performance standards.
According to the CD.
Even though it's contaminated.
According to the CD.
So they're
According
not,
to the CD, they're not exceeding any standards.
they're not exceeding standards that could be.
And I acknowledge the groundwater is contaminated. So these two wells, we only got a few more, so I keep going. So these are the two wells we're looking at, and since these two, if you remember, were high or exceeded a benchmark, we had GE put in one downgrade to measure that exact reason. This one we have not seen for GMA 4.7, we have not seen the PCE or TCE. Overlaid on it, we're talking about the groundwater management areas. There's what's called the groundwater management area 2, which is south of that, which also we have monitored and checked next to the buildings and checked again and have not seen exceedances.
Is that groundwater area 2, is that where a lot of the in-home sump pump holes had?
That would be farther up East Street. This is a little bit more east.
Okay, point.
Eastern.
Which
the homes, more, are up here that I think you're talking about.
For the sump pumps?
Yeah, way up there, not way up there, but up there. And then this is actually Merrill Road.
Oh,
So you'd have to
okay.
go over Merrill Road, across the bridge down to East Street a fair amount of way.
But isn't one of those buildings there on Merrill Road? Well, it's not on Merrill Road, it's on East Street, actually. There's a building that's been there, it's the Patrica Building that it's known, it's been shut up for 15,
I would have to look
20
at
years.
that.
And the story on the street, at least, and I don't know whether this is true or not, but what everybody talks about is the vapors that get into that building from the groundwater
I will
coming across
look
the
at
street.
that. I think we have a well there.
What's the address, Tim? Is on East Street?
444 Merrill Road or one of
Isn't
those.
that way east?
It's-
That's actually in the Uncommit Brook area. That would be in GMA 3 if
that's
you were
not
looking for
there.
that. It's not here, but
That's when we drove by when we did the tour you were taking.
Yeah.
That's near Tio's, like, right down there.
right. So we have wells next to those buildings down there.
Okay.
Where you eat hot
And the
dogs.
state has separate wells in an area called Commercial Street. But there's no exceed, all I can say is look at the data, there's no exceedances, but we do want to keep watching it.
So just because of the time, do you need any more slides? And then I
Just
kinda
this one right here that I think Judy's been talking about, ASW 5, I have it for a different reason, but yeah, that is a supply well. This is Pittsfield, I don't know the latest incarnation of the name, cogen facility it used to be called, or power plant.
Yes.
They don't make steam anymore, they work peak hours and generate electricity, so it's no longer a cogeneration facility. They do use what's called ASW 5 as their well, I think it's for cooling. So they're big cooling towers, and it's industrial cooling supply well.
Who owns the groundwater?
GE owns the land, so they own the groundwater, they are liable for EPA for the consent decree for the groundwater. That facility has a permit from the state to use that groundwater.
And it's my understanding that they have some legal document, easement, something, with General Electric in order to
Use the groundwater. Yes, absolutely.
use the contaminated groundwater.
They do.
But they have to test it,
They test it.
and you can get all the data from DEP.
Does it come heated? Does it get
There's the
heated
data.
at PGC?
It's cooling water, so it would get hot because you're using it to cool something
Is
that's
it
hot.
contained or
It
released?
goes into the air.
It's released
Any
through the air.
anecdotal air testing in PGC? Or is
No, but
it,
there's water testing
Here's-
as it goes up. And I was shocked at how clean it is, because that's at the same level where GE used to inject.
All right, this is the groundwater data. Now, this is from the well, from that supply well. If they test it somewhere else, I'm not aware.
So what you saw, you've seen non-detect since
Since
2012?
2000, now that may be because they went to peak operation only. I don't know. All I know is this is the data.
no air monitoring in PGC? Or on their stacks? Does it come out of stack?
I don't know anything about the, I don't know anything about the air permit.
Yeah.
There's an air permit and there's stacks.
And they emit more carbon dioxide than any other facility in the Berkshires.
And are there any decommissioned pump and treat wells in that whole area?
There's never been pump and treat wells, so I don't think, I'm not sure I followed the question.
Just that? Were there any
There
pump
were
and
never
treat
pump and
wells
treat
there?
wells that I'm aware of in that area.
Would it ever be indicated with high enough numbers?
Because they're not above any standards right now.
If it ever happened?
If they exceed performance standards, then we go through what we just talked about in GMA 1. They can propose an alternate risk-based standard and we go down that road.
Or if the GW levels, threshold levels were lowered?
They could be lower, they have been low, they have changed, and I know if they change, GE has to use the new number.
Pittsfield should work on getting those GW levels lowered.
Those are statewide. So the only other point I wanted to make is that ASW 5 and that 16B, those are two that I have data from prior to the APCA. It's being constructed, and both of them show PCE and TCE. Both of them show contamination prior to the APCA. So you can take that for whatever it is. I don't take it as increasing trends. I agree it's contaminated. It's always been contaminated. It always will be.
So let me just do a check. So it is a little past our typical adjournment time. We may want to wrap this up. Tim, we had your piece about this 2001 agreement process stuff. We can figure out something else to do with. So just, can people kind of hang for maybe 5-10 more minutes?
I have a single
And the bridges,
question
too.
about cadmium. Are you going to address cadmium?
Cadmium has had periodic exceedances in maybe 1 or 2 wells, but not consistent. I think there was one in that one MW whatever. We actually put a different well downgrading of that. There's 2 wells downgrading of that we made GE continue to sample for cadmium. We didn't see it migrating anywhere. Once in a while it does show up above I think the GW, it wouldn't be volatile, so it'd be above the GW3 standard.
This was high.
But if you look at the graph over time, you'll see it's periodic. So yes, that is true. That is the only other compound that I've seen exceed any of the benchmarks or GW3. Cadmium, there may have been some others, one-time hits. I don't remember them all. The primary contaminants that I focus on is the PCE and the TCE.
The nonchalance about, it's just, and I don't mean your nonchalance, I just mean it's a very contaminated area. And maybe someday, there will be an alternative destruction technology available to get down into the groundwater and act upon it.
I didn't mean to be nonchalant. I just have this.
I didn't say.
No, and I just want to. It is contaminated groundwater, and it's a shame. I have to follow the CD.
Okay, so maybe quickly, Tim, do you want to raise the issue around 2001 agreement with HRI, or do you want to postpone that till next meeting? Up to you.
Well, I wanted to raise it, but I wanted to raise it before surface water. That took a long time, and I'm not quite sure it's worth. I mean, I'm going to just pass something out. You guys can read it and think about it. But when HRI settled a motion to intervene back in the year 2000, we had EPA promise a bunch of things. We are in contention with EPA saying they think that they've complied with the most important one. We say they haven't complied. And this is about Mindy Luber and what she said at a press conference after we had made our agreement with this. And I'll just read it quickly because it's only about 30 words. It says the agreement includes, among other things, EPA's commitment to identify and potentially test new and innovative treatment technologies to protect innocent property owners from cleanup liability and assure these property owners that should recontamination occur, we will be here with DEP to make sure it is cleaned up one way or another. That was just something we asked for because there had been a couple of sites that were resampled and contamination reappeared. So we're very concerned that a lot of the sites through the years, seeing how there's hundreds of them, probably didn't get sampled like these other sites. But we're making the point with this is that we were promised pilot tests with innovative technology. It's something that we've been trying, to communicate with EPA with, but they have been shutting us down and shutting down this whole notion of even investigating this. And I'm here to say that this should be something the CCC should be investigating, and I think that that the EPA in good faith should be investigating with us. You come back and tell us, well, that you have basically complied with this statement, and the way you do that is by saying that, well, we put activated carbon in the settlement, and this is ridiculous because activated carbon is a very old technology. It's not one of the new technologies. It was developed back in the 80s. So to tell us that it's new technology is just absurd. And we just want to make the point that they promised us that we should be doing this as an exercise, which I think would be a great benefit to the cleanup. And a lot of people in Berkshire County also believe that we should be pursuing this idea of trying to use a better way. So this has been pretty much shut down by the EPA. But I'm just going to pass these around because it has the statement from Mindy Luber at the press conference. We'll give you an idea that she did say these things and did promise them. And that was also along with there's a written agreement that has other things on this besides this, but this is probably the most important.
So that's what I have up is a written agreement, and we can route that. I think that's the same one you should have. If we didn't route that, we can. That was the agreement.
How many pages is this?
4. 4.
Okay, so we can make it available to everybody. Okay.
Oh yeah, I mean PDF.
So I think, I want to
Four-page
know.
agreement. We
Okay,
can
so
route.
EPA, I mean, Tim's had a chance to raise the concern. EPA, any response or comment at this point? We may leave it at that, but
No, I mean,
Tim?
we've worked hard for a long time on trying to find innovative technologies. And we worked a lot with Tim on that. Gone down many different roads looking for innovative technologies. We also put into our cleanup plan, the possibility of adaptive management if other things come up. So we're not done looking, but we feel like Susan, Dean, Brian, and me spent a lot of time on trying to figure out what would be a emerging technology that would take care of the PCB in the river and in the floodplain. And activated carbon is one example of one that has proven to be successful. There aren't many examples, and I'm not the technical or scientist person, but we have. It's something that I guess I just disagree with the way Tim characterized it, but I share the frustration. I thought when we signed this that all of us, sometime between 2000 and when the remedy was selected, that something would emerge. And for PCBs, that hasn't happened, and we're still, during the cleanup, we'll still be open to suggestions, and that's why the adaptive management is written the way it is in the cleanup plan. Adaptive management is a way of it allows EPA or General Electric, if it sees a better way to do things, they could propose it to us, or EPA could dictate.
The only thing I would add is when we route this, these are the first, you can read it for yourself. That's the agreement. It's item 1 and those 4 bullets. So that's what EPA agreed to. Like Tim said, we felt we met it. And one other thing we did is we pushed you very hard to do a pilot test in the corrective measure study, which they did, which was, I believe, chemical extraction.
So because of the late hour, I think we want to note the disagreement. We've got the materials available for people. And then I think, Tim, if you feel like this wants to be a specific agenda item where we spend more time doing it earlier in the night, let us know and we can include that in the next meeting in the early 2019.
I just think it's disingenuous to say that in the year 2000, we're now in 2018, it's a very robust market of R&D with alternative technologies, and as you know, in our brief, we also fully articulated what's going on in Vietnam with dioxin, which is even more complicated than PCBs and the PCB molecule. Dioxin is even more toxic and has more, and the molecular bonds are even stronger. And they are fully embracing, along with the federal government, through USA aid, the use of thermal desorption with excellent results. So how can the United States government be working on dioxin contamination, massive dioxin contamination at the Vietnamese airports where the barrels were stored, and that's okay with the United States government, but thermal desorption in Massachusetts isn't viable.
Judy, that was in your comment letter to the, that was in your comment letter you had to the EAB, or?
It was in the appeal, in the brief.
It was in the
whatever
the appellate brief.
The appellate brief, yeah.
So how can it be? How can it be that the government is okay one place with tangible positive results, and then in another site it's a no-go?
Well, I think our answer would be our same answer that we put in our response brief, which I don't want to reread, but it's there if people want to read it.
All right, so again, it's late, so I want to note this again. If folks want this on the agenda for further discussion in detail, we can do that. So I think when people think about that, when we do the agenda planning for next meeting, let us know and we can figure out how to do it. All right, we know the differences of opinion on this. Last thing, Judy, you'd asked about bridges.
There's a lot of bridges, Susan, and John in Massachusetts and in Connecticut. There's a new road. There's Cottage Street in Great Barrington. The big bridge on Route 7 in Great Barrington is going to be replaced. They're still having trouble with the bridge in Housatonic. There's another one in Sheffield that's going to be replaced. Of course, the Mill Street Bridge, where the Telelectric Dam is now slated, and that's all good stuff for crumbling infrastructure. But EPA and neither of the departments of energy, quote, and environmental protection monitor the, and not to mention Stevenson Dam. There's a whole new bridge going in over a very contaminated area of Stevenson, above Stevenson Dam. And every bridge replacement, every bridge repair, you do nothing to either monitor downstream transport or to put in place anything to abate downstream transport. You just say, oh, it's DOT, it's the Departments of Transportation, oh, it's this one, oh, it's that one. It doesn't come under our purview. And especially for Connecticut, with all these dams, with all of these bridges in Massachusetts, we're going to get another spike down in Connecticut. But of course it won't be monitored. And of course, any fish sampling has to take place by GE because Connecticut is so broke. You know, there's a lot of work about to happen in the river.
Susan, you had your placard up, so responding to that, then I'll go to Tim.
Right. I appreciate your concerns, Judy. As far as Stevenson Dam goes and the replacement of the bridge that currently goes over the dam, that was an issue that you or folks asked to be addressed at the CCC meeting that was held in Connecticut recently. And there was a presentation on that. Tracy Ayack from our department gave that presentation. It is a DOT project. It had been mothballed for a while. It is now becoming active again. Tracy did indicate that the department is looking at PCB levels in the sediments and concerns about disturbance of those sediments as the project goes forward. So the department is actively monitoring that project as it moves forward. It's not, and I think it was maybe sometime this fall, there was information given at the end of the presentation, so you can follow on the DOT website, because there's going to be opportunities for public comment and so forth, but the department is involved with that.
It would be good for you to put out an email also, you know, to all of us for updates and when those abilities for comment are open.
Okay, it's a DOT process, not a Connecticut DEP process, but I'm looking to make a note of your comment.
Tim.
Yeah, I just want to mention that these bridges, I learned about the bridges by looking out my picture window one day, and there's a whole team of machines down there, and they're pounding and they're doing this, and I went down there and they're pounding in, I don't know what you call them, but pylons of some sort, you know, into the ground by this bridge. And we thought, this is odd. We've heard of no replacement of the bridge or no Conservation Commission things going on or anything about this bridge. And my wife went down to talk to the engineers that were working on the bridge. And she said, so who's doing this work? He says, well, we're doing the work, but GE's paying for it. So that's something that I think we need to know, and it would be good to know. I think you guys probably don't, do you know they're doing the bridge work?
That's the first I heard of it.
Yeah, well, it's the first I heard of it too, so I'm just saying that the bridge thing's important because they're just going ahead and doing something evidently without notifying anybody.
This is a public bridge or public
and
road.
by putting pylons in that part of the stream, which is very close to the river, and it does flood pretty much every year there, right up to the railroad tracks, where they're putting in these pylons. And if every bridge they're doing along the river, they're not taking any care to notify people that they're working on that bridge, I think is not a good thing.
Before I say I don't know anything about it, a few years ago I did talk to, I believe it was DOT, about a bridge, and we looked at some data and I gave recommendations about where to do some sampling. I think all the pilings were going to be out of the sediment. I don't know if it's this bridge, but I did have some conversation with a consultant. I don't know if it was DOT or CSX or both. but I haven't heard from anybody in several years.
It's not the CSX line, is it?
I don't think so. I know when my initial discussions were on CSX and the highway. They were two different discussions I had. They were South County.
This is the, you know, the Danbury to Pittsfield line. I don't think CSX.
Or the rail line, let me put that way. Housatonic.
Railroad.
I do remember some discussion several years ago, but not recently.
So apparently GE is upgrading the line from the Connecticut border to Pittsfield. And
I didn't hear that. All I heard was they said they might be doing something with these pilings. Did you hear that GE's upgrading the rail?
No, I didn't hear that.
just that one where
Well,
you're at?
every bridge from Pittsfield on down, I started driving around looking at the bridges, and they had crews at each bridge, looking like they wanted to get those bridges done pretty quick.
So is there any follow-up to this? We can just find out what the project is, or?
That's it. I know what my wife knows.
Put Dean on it.
Yeah.
It's an action item.
DOT can talk to GE about soil disposal. That was my recommendation to them.
So
if they're generating soil, they
But
can
John
contact
offered to ask DOT and see if we can.
Yeah, I can ask DOT what their schedule is on all these bridges.
We're talking about railroad bridges and we're talking about vehicle bridges, vehicular bridges.
So John will be willing to take an action, and we'll kind of try to follow up in writing at the next meeting, okay?
Great.
All right, so speaking of which, process recommendations, I have thoughts. We did slides. We kind of tried to put a finer point on some things to do. We will send them out to you all. Some of those things are pretty simple to just start doing. So we'll send them out, and we'll say to you, if there's anything in here you hate, tell us so we won't do it. But otherwise, we're just going to start doing some of the things in the slides in terms of just modest process recommendations. We need to get out of scheduled meetings for 2019. So we'll work with you all and EPA and the two DEPs to kind of get a schedule in place by the end of the year for our 4 meetings in 2019. Okay, so I thought I saw another placard up quickly.
No, just a quick question about the meeting. So are there two things going on? Would the CCC be part of the informational meeting that Tim mentioned after November? Kind of a public informational meeting? And would there be two sort of parallel things going on?
I would think there'd be two parallel things. I think the group, assuming the group wants us to have regularly scheduled CCC meetings, we will do that.
Okay.
And we will supplement it as needed. That would be is that what you were thinking, Tim? It would be like a supplemental meeting if we have a public meeting on mediation.
Right.
Whatever.
I think if there's a public meeting on the mediation, I was thinking it would be open to everybody in the public.
Yeah, so it would be in addition to our regularly scheduled CCC meeting.
But there wouldn't be a CCC meeting right next to it or anything like that.
I'll try and space it
I just
out.
thought it would be one public meeting.
And the CCC would be on the invite list or somehow given a heads up?
Whatever the,
Yes.
Perfect, thank you.
Yep, you bet, good question.
We were told by Mr. I guess he's an Attorney Bickerman, that any entity, the Housatonic Clean River Coalition, Stop the Dumps, Citizens for PCB Removal, anyone can enter into the mediation provided they come under one of the groups like HRI, and that the confidentiality agreement is signed. Is that accurate?
You have to ask him.
That's what he said to us. Is that your understanding?
That's what he said to us.
That's what he said to us.
So just specifically, if Reed wants to, can Reed reach out to Bickerman and say, if I work with Tim or whatever?
Reed represents Stop the Dumps. You are the Housatonic Clean River Coalition. This is Citizens for PCB Removal. And I don't, the commission, I don't think, but that's what we were told.
So is it okay, Tim, if we make available to the CCC Bickerman's contact information and they can do with it what they will? Is that okay?
Yeah, I think it's public information.
Okay, well, I mean, why don't, if EPA would send us Bickerman's email, we'll make that available to all of you and then you can have it.
Yeah, I don't have it with me, but
no,
if I have it.
I probably have it somewhere in my mess, so I'll try to find it. But we'll try to get that out to you in the next day or two. And
Who's running PETA now?
Corey Thurston is still officially the executive director.
New buildings going up on PETA land. It might be nice to have him generate a report to the CCC.
I think it'd be great if you asked him.
You can walk.
Judy, for the next agenda.
You could go to the
we'll
PETA also,
set this
as,
aside.
on a serious note, they have their own open.
Okay, everybody's 8 o'clock, so we're beyond time. So thank you, Dean, for rich, detailed presentations. Thank you, CCC, for good and hard and important questions. We got through most of it. Sorry, Tim, to put your piece off to the end. I know we did a short trip, so we can come back. Public, we may have worn you out, but any brief public comments before we wrap up today? Yes, sir.
Yes.
Mr. Wynn.
I think it kind of bookends what James said earlier, but there are a lot of dissatisfied citizens of Berkshire County here, and there are a lot of topics that need to be discussed. I think somebody ought to make another effort to get GE to the table. I think it shows a complete lack of respect for all of us, and they need to be here.
Thank you.
And Charlie Chamberini, I also believe that 4 meetings is not, a year is not enough. I've said it before, I think we need to have 6. I don't get paid to be here, but I'm going to be here. If you have 6, if you have 8, I will be here. I'll drag her here if I have to. She'll be here too. We don't get paid to be here, but we'll be here. We need more than 4 meetings a year. There's too much information that's going there.
We don't have to have 3-hour meetings.
Okay, thank you all very much. Happy holidays coming up. We'll get our meeting scheduled for 19. We'll take and revise what Charlie's concerned about number of meetings. And we have a number of action items we'll follow up with, some sooner rather than later, the information out. Thank you all, everybody.
Thank you.